Sunday, March 17th, 1968. Elvis Presley walked into a small black church in rural Mississippi, searching for something he'd lost somewhere along the way to fame. What happened when an 8-year-old boy who'd never heard of Elvis Presley started singing changed how Elvis understood his own gift. Elvis had been driving for hours with no particular destination in mind. It was one of those Sunday mornings when the weight of being Elvis Presley felt heavier than usual. The performances, the movies, the constant demands, the feeling that he was becoming more product than person. He needed to find something real, something that reminded him why music mattered in the first place. He'd left Memphis before dawn, telling no one where he was going, wearing plain clothes, sunglasses, and a cap pulled low, just driving through the back roads of Mississippi, the same roads he'd traveled as a poor kid from Tupelo, back when music was still pure and uncomplicated. Around 10:30 in the morning, Elvis heard something that made him pull his car to the side of the road. Singing. Gospel singing, coming from a small white wooden church set back from the road, partially hidden by oak trees heavy with Spanish moss. The church was tiny, barely more than a large room with a cross on top. The paint was peeling in places, and the steps leading to the front door sagged slightly in the middle from decades of use. But the sound coming from inside was anything but worn out. It was alive, vibrant, full of the kind of raw spiritual power that no amount of money could buy or studio could manufacture. Elvis sat in his car for a moment, listening. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. This was the sound of people singing not for an audience, not for money, not for fame, but because they believed every word they were singing. He got out of the car and walked slowly toward the church. Through the open windows, he could see inside. About 40 people, all black, all dressed in their Sunday best, singing with their whole hearts. An elderly woman at an old upright piano, a pastor in a simple suit standing at a wooden pulpit. Children sitting with their families, some singing along, some just listening. Elvis stood at the door, uncertain. This wasn't his church. These weren't his people, at least not in the way the world usually divided people. Would he be welcome? Would his presence disrupt something sacred? As he hesitated, a small hand reached out and took his. Elvis looked down to see a boy, maybe 8 years old, with wide brown eyes and a gentle smile. The boy didn't say anything, just held Elvis's hand and gently pulled him inside. The boy led Elvis to a spot near the back and gestured for him to sit. Then the boy sat down next to him, as natural as if Elvis had always been there. A few people glanced back at the stranger in sunglasses, but no one stared, no one whispered. The singing continued without interruption. Elvis removed his sunglasses and cap, but in the dim light of the church and without the elaborate costumes and styled hair of his performances, he was just another man in plain clothes. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew that Elvis Presley was sitting in their church. The congregation was singing an old hymn, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the small wooden building. Elvis had sung gospel all his life, had won Grammy Awards for his gospel albums, but listening to these voices, he felt like a student in the presence of masters. The hymn ended, and the pastor said a few words about faith and perseverance. Then he asked if anyone felt moved to share a song or a testimony. Several people stood and sang, an elderly man with a voice that trembled with age but rang with conviction. A middle-aged woman whose singing made several people in the congregation cry. Each performance was honest, unpolished,
and more moving than anything Elvis had heard on any stage. Then the boy next to Elvis stood up. He was small for his age, wearing pants that were slightly too big and a shirt that had been carefully ironed despite being worn thin in places. He walked to the front of the church with no hesitation, no nervousness, just quiet confidence. "I'd like to sing," the boy said, his voice clear and soft. The pastor smiled. "Go ahead, Samuel. Bless us with your gift." Samuel stood in front of the small congregation, closed his eyes for a moment, and then began to sing. He didn't have any accompaniment, just his voice, pure and clear, singing the old gospel standard that his grandmother had taught him. Elvis felt something break open inside his chest. The boy's voice wasn't technically perfect. There were no vocal runs or showmanship, but there was something in it that Elvis hadn't heard in years, maybe hadn't heard since he was young himself. Complete, unguarded sincerity. The boy wasn't performing, he was praying. Every note was an offering, every word a genuine expression of faith. Samuel sang about grace and mercy, about being held in loving arms, about not being alone even in the darkest times. His small voice filled the church, not through volume, but through purity. It was like listening to what an angel might sound like if angels were 8-year-old boys from Mississippi who'd never had a music lesson, but understood music in their souls. Elvis felt tears running down his face. He didn't try to hide them. Around him, other people were crying too. This was why gospel music existed, not to win awards or fill arenas, but to create moments like this, where heaven felt close enough to touch. When Samuel finished, he opened his eyes and smiled, not with pride, but with simple joy. He walked back to his seat next to Elvis as the congregation said, "Amen," and "Bless you, child." Elvis couldn't help himself. He stood up, and before he knew what he was doing, he was applauding. Not the polite church applause of a few claps, but genuine, sustained applause, the kind he'd received thousands of times but had rarely given. The congregation looked at him with mild surprise. Applause wasn't common in their services, but they smiled at the stranger's obvious emotion. "That was beautiful, son," the pastor said to Samuel. "Thank you for sharing your gift." Samuel sat back down next to Elvis, and Elvis leaned over and whispered, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Samuel looked up at him with those wide brown eyes. "Thank you, sir. Do you like to sing?" "I do," Elvis said quietly. "Would you like to sing something?" Samuel asked with the innocent directness of a child who didn't know about stage fright or performance anxiety. Elvis hesitated. He hadn't come here to perform. He'd come to listen, to find something he'd lost. But looking at Samuel's expectant face, at the welcoming atmosphere of this small church, he felt something stir inside him. "I don't want to intrude," Elvis said. Samuel took his hand again. "You're not intruding. That's not how church works. Everyone's welcome." The simple wisdom of that statement hit Elvis hard. Everyone's welcome. When had he last felt truly welcome anywhere? When had he last been in a space where he was just a person, not Elvis Presley, the product, the phenomenon, the king of rock and roll? Samuel stood up, still holding Elvis's hand. "Pastor, this man would like to sing too." The pastor nodded with that same gentle welcome. "Come on up, brother. What's your name?" Elvis stood, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't before performances in years. "My name's Elvis, sir." A few people in the congregation stirred slightly at the name, but in 1968, in this small rural church, not everyone owned a television or listened to popular radio. To them, Elvis was just a name, nothing more. "Well, Elvis, we'd be honored to hear you sing," the pastor said. Elvis walked to the front of the church. He looked at the faces watching him with open, accepting expressions. No screaming, no cameras, No expectations except that he share something true. I'd like to sing, if that's all right. His voice was shaking slightly. Samuel here reminded me what singing is really about. I want to try to do what he did. Just sing from the heart.
He closed his eyes, just as Samuel had done, and began to sing the same hymn. No microphone, no band, no elaborate arrangement, just his voice, stripped of all the production and polish, singing the words that had comforted his own mother when she was alive. Elvis sang quietly at first, almost like he was relearning how to sing, remembering what it felt like before fame complicated everything. But as he continued, his voice grew stronger, not louder necessarily, but more present, more honest. He sang every word like he meant it, like he needed it to be true. And maybe he did. Maybe in that moment, Elvis Presley needed to believe in grace and mercy and being held in loving arms as much as anyone who'd ever walked through those church doors. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then the pastor stood up, walked over to Elvis, and embraced him. "Brother," the pastor said quietly, "you've been carrying something heavy. I hope you can leave some of it here with us." Elvis couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face openly now. The congregation began to sing again, a joyful hymn this time, and they gestured for Elvis to stay up front. Samuel ran up and stood next to him, taking his hand again. And Elvis Presley, who'd performed for millions, stood in a small Mississippi church and sang gospel with 40 people who had no idea who he was. And it felt like coming home. After the service ended, Elvis tried to slip away quietly, but Samuel caught up with him outside. "Are you leaving?" the boy asked. "I should," Elvis said, "but I want to thank you. What you did in there, the way you sang, you reminded me of something important." "What's that?" Samuel asked. "That it's not about how you sound or how many people are watching. It's about meaning what you sing, about letting it come from somewhere real." Samuel tilted his head, considering this. "My grandmother says singing is praying twice, once with words and once with your heart." Elvis knelt down to Samuel's eye level. "Your grandmother is very wise. Can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "Have you ever heard of Elvis Presley?" Samuel thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, sir. Should I have?" Elvis smiled, and it was perhaps the most genuine smile he'd managed in months. No, you shouldn't have. It's better this way." He reached into his pocket and pulled out all the cash he had with him, several $100s, and pressed it into Samuel's small hand. "This is for your church, for the piano, for whatever they need. Don't tell them who it's from. Just tell them it's from someone who needed what you gave him today." Samuel looked at the money with wide eyes. "This is a lot of money, sir." "It's not nearly enough for what you gave me. Promise me something, Samuel. Promise me you'll keep singing exactly the way you sang today. Don't let anyone make you sing differently. Don't let them polish it or package it or turn it into something it's not. Keep it pure." "I promise," Samuel said seriously. Elvis stood up, put his sunglasses and cap back on, and walked to his car. He drove away from that small church feeling lighter than he had in years. Samuel stood watching the stranger's car disappear down the road, then ran back inside to give the pastor the money. The congregation gathered around in amazement, trying to figure out who the stranger had been and why he'd given them such a generous gift. "He said his name was Elvis," Samuel told them. "He sang real pretty." An elderly woman in the congregation paused. "Elvis? Did you say Elvis?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman's eyes went wide. Lord have mercy, that was Elvis Presley. That was the Elvis Presley in our church. The congregation erupted in excited chatter.
They'd just worshipped with one of the most famous men in the world and hadn't known it. The story would be told and retold for generations. But for Elvis, driving back toward Memphis, the important part wasn't that he'd been in their church. The important part was what Samuel had given him. A reminder that music, real music, wasn't about fame or fortune or Grammy Awards. It was about connecting with something deeper, something true. Elvis kept his promise to return to gospel music with renewed dedication after that day. He'd always loved gospel, but after meeting Samuel, it became even more important to him. He recorded several gospel albums in the following years, and people who knew him said there was something different about those recordings, something more raw and honest than before. Samuel grew up in that small Mississippi church. He became a music teacher, teaching children in rural schools about the power of song. He never became famous, never recorded an album or performed on a big stage, but he taught hundreds of children to sing with the same purity and honesty that had moved Elvis Presley to tears that Sunday morning. When Elvis died in 1977, Samuel was 17 years old. He heard the news on the radio and felt a strange connection to this famous man he'd met only once. He remembered the stranger in his church who'd sung with tears running down his face, who'd knelt down and asked him to keep his singing pure. Only then did Samuel fully understand what had happened that day. Elvis Presley, at the peak of his fame, had walked into a small black church searching for something he'd lost. And an 8-year-old boy who'd never heard of Elvis Presley had reminded him what it was.
The money Elvis left was used to repair the church's piano, fix the roof, and buy hymn books for the congregation. They used it carefully, making it last for years, always remembering it as a gift from the stranger who'd needed what they had to offer more than they'd needed what he could give. The story of Elvis's visit became part of the church's history, passed down through generations. But the most important part of the story wasn't that Elvis had been there. It was what Samuel had taught Elvis and what Elvis had taught Samuel in return. That real music, the kind that matters, isn't about performance, it's about truth. It's about opening your heart and letting something pure flow through. Samuel kept the promise he made to Elvis. He never let anyone change the way he sang. He never pursued fame or commercial success. He just sang the way his grandmother taught him, the way he'd sung that Sunday morning when he'd unknowingly taught Elvis Presley one of the most important lessons of his life. And every time Samuel sang, every time he taught a child to sing from the heart rather than for applause, he honored that promise. He kept it pure, just like Elvis had asked him to. If this story of humility, pure faith, and music that transcends barriers moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of staying true to yourself. Have you ever learned something important from an unexpected teacher? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that reveal what really matters.